the long trail.
You know, the role of women is fascinating in Japan. We're seeing in Japan now, it's the women who have taken the forefront in weaning the country from nuclear power. The men quite frequently are saying, well, the government says it's good, therefore it must be good. And whereas the women who are, in addition to their personal concerns as mothers are worried about their children, have taken the lead and are saying, we don't want nuclear power. And if you look at the big demonstrations and all, certainly there are men there, and I don't mean to minimize that, but the movement got its momentum because the women in Japan have taken control. That's significant for that culture, because in general the women are not expected to take a leadership role like that. It's really exciting.
Yes, and this past weekend there have been enormous demonstrations of support for the end of nuclear power in Japan. In Japan, the demonstrations have been in Japan and supporting that. Yes, yeah, and it's interesting to see how the headlines or the media cover it here. You know, they'll say the last nuclear power plant is closed down, and then they'll say, but what about when summer comes? What about when the heat comes? And so there's always the caveat that this is not a good thing. And I just want to, not to take a detour in this, but to cite the editorial in today's New York Times.
The end of clean energy subsidies?
Well, yes. Yet this productive, it's about how nuclear is clean energy. Again, they're saying in this editorial that nuclear power is clean energy.
What they mean is that it's not adding to the carbon footprint, but it's certainly not clean.
But it is adding to the carbon footprint immensely, because in making the nuclear fuel, for example, it's Paducah, Kentucky, where one of the fabrication plants is located, and it's using the dirtiest coal that we have anywhere in the country, and it uses huge amounts, and huge amounts of fossil fuels are used in the mining process. Mm-hmm. And none of that is ever figured in. None of the waste disposal is figured into the cost of nuclear or its carbon footprint, or how all of that's going to be combined in the equipment used to take apart a nuclear site and move the waste, and none of that is anywhere figured into the footprint. And when you do, their carbon footprint is quite high.
A friend of mine is Peter Bradford, who's a former NRC commissioner and former chair of the Public Service Commission in New York. And I think he sums up the nuclear issue and subsidies and global warming the best I've ever heard. He said, trying to solve global warming by building nuclear plants is like trying to solve global hunger by serving everyone caviar.
Very good point.
Very good point,
yeah,
yes.
And your point about the carbon footprint is, I've never heard that expressed so succinctly and so well.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I was thinking earlier, and I made a note to bring the discussion back to here, when you were talking about Japan's planning for the future and how they're looking at that they can't do it without nuclear. Dr. Arjan Makajani, who's right outside of Washington, D.C., and he founded an organization called IEER.org. He has a book out, and it's free on his website. You can download it, or you can donate to the website and buy it. It's called Carbon Free and Nuclear Free, and it's a road plan that he made for energy planning in the U.S. He's a nuclear engineer. He's a physicist. He's a Ph.D., and he was an energy planner in the Carter administration. And he knows his stuff almost better than anyone in the world. And he answers a lot of the storage issues that you were talking about and transmission issues. I think what energy planners and engineers throughout the world need to do is get out of the box. Think outside the box. You have to start with, and this is what a lot of the women and mothers are asking for in Japan, start with the premise there's no more nuclear because of the contamination. It's not worth risking children's lives. It's not worth risking inhabitable areas for generations upon generations. And therefore, get outside the box and let's, you know, when you look at Japan and you look at the U.S., these are countries who have been leaders in technological growth. Are they saying now, whoops, we've hit our limit, we can't think any new ideas and we can only stick with oil and nuclear and gas fracking because we can't think any clearer, our minds are dead now? I don't buy that premise.
I think it's fascinating. The nuclear industry says if we spend enough money on it, we can figure out a way to store nuclear waste for 250,000 years. But they're also saying, well, you can't have solar and wind because we can't figure out a way of storing the electricity.
Right.
If we can store nuclear waste for 250,000 years, we can certainly figure out a way of taking out the ebbs and flows in an electric cycle.
And there are some ways. You know, you can store water in it. You can pump water back up with renewable energy, and then use it to create more energy later. There are some ways. But one of the things you're saying, I wanted to give the example of solar hot water. You don't need to conserve that because it's direct. The sun heats the water. It's the oldest renewable energy technology we have that's been around for a long time. In Japan, hardly anyone uses it. And I found this astonishing. The reason that they're not using it is it became quite popular in the early 80s after the energy crisis. And the cheaper varieties don't require a pump. You can just use water where it's temperate, which most of Japan is, where it's not going to freeze. Then you can see the tank on somebody's roof. And it just circulates through gravity, and when it heats up, it comes back, it comes down, and it works very well.
And what generates the pump?
You don't need a pump for it.
The hot water is less dense than the cold water, so the density difference.
It works fine, as long as your water doesn't freeze. The other type, the one that I have on my roof now, for instance, you have to have an antifreeze in it. You pump the antifreeze, and there's a heat exchange pump down in your house, which is it's a minimal expenditure. I love my hot water. But what happened was, people would see the tanks, so you could see somebody had that, and, quote, salespeople would come and tell people that they had to put chemicals in their tanks and basically, they were con artists. And they would particularly pick on elderly people who had these systems, so they got a bad name. And then a lot of these companies were fly-by-night and went out of business. So now nobody wants solar hot water because it's supposed to be lower class, and you can't trust the people who do them, which is mind-bogglingly doesn't make any sense. So in Tokyo, they're trying to give big subsidies for solar hot water because they know it makes sense. But trying to convince people to have it is difficult. So you have all these image problems and misperceptions.
Well, when we moved to Vermont, when we lived in Connecticut, we had a house that was amazing. It had active and passive solar, and it was built in the 1970s. And it was in exact same climate we're living in now, because being near the lake, it's moderated, and we're in the same zone, and because we're at the highest part of Connecticut, a mountaintop. And it was just during the day, I had to ask people if I was going to their homes or going out anywhere what the heat was, because the house was always at 80 in the winter from natural sunlight, from this, and we didn't have water on the roof. It was a fan system, and there was water storage in the basement, and then we heated our hot water with it as well.
Wonderful.
So,
now this is not new technology. It's interesting. Union of Concerned Scientists has done a study where they looked at all the subsidies that have been put into nuclear over 70 years. And they've determined that if those subsidies would have raised nuclear's price by 5 cents. So the price of electricity from a nuclear plant is right now around 5. It should be 10, except that we, as taxpayers, have subsidized the industry for 70 years. So when I hear, well, you shouldn't subsidize solar, we're talking about a new technology versus a 70-year-old technology. I think there's a role for subsidies on new technology, but when something gets to be 70 years old, you either got it right or you shut it down.
Can I show another one of my little
Of course,
pictures here?
yeah. Please do.
This is a rice seedlings about to be transplanted. I got there in early May, and so they were just about to plant their rice seedlings. Now, this just brings up a whole other issue of food. The Japanese import 60% of their food. They used to be totally self-sustaining, and they could be self-sustaining again. Over, I think, 40% of their rice paddies are lying fallow. They're not growing anything whatsoever now. Why? Because after World War II, the American occupation convinced them that eating rice wasn't really that good for you. What you wanted was wheat and bread. Rice was old-fashioned. So they don't eat nearly as much rice as they used to. One of the things they could do with those fallow rice paddies would be to grow a strain of rice that's meant for animal feed mostly, but it grows very, very quickly. It doesn't need pesticides. They could make biofuel out of it, but they're not. They're not doing anything with it. Let me just show you, let me just rip through this a second. This is the cedar that I told you about. And this was at the home of this wonderful couple. This is my favorite part of my whole trip. Let me see if I can find a picture of them. Ah, there he is. I had seen this couple in a documentary film made about 20 years ago. And they were struggling farmers, but they were hoping that their son, who was 15, was going to take over. Only he didn't, it turns out. I sought them out to find out what had happened. He's gone on and taken a job in the city. He got a degree in agriculture, but he's an agricultural bureaucrat. But now he has a 15-year-old son, and they're desperately hoping that he will take over this absolutely gorgeous farm. They are self-sustaining. So it's just a portrait of what is possible. This is, by the way, a hydroelectric plant, but it shows how that they see the big tank up there. The water is coming from a river on the other side of the mountain. They've drilled a tunnel through. So there's a lot of things that don't make a whole lot of sense about what they're doing, not just nuclear.
But at the same time as you would write that doesn't make any sense, you marvel at the fact that they drilled that tunnel and their expertise in so many technological things.
They're amazing.
So that
so if they can drill tunnels for that, they can certainly drill it for geothermal energy.
Exactly, and that's one of the major points you make. And well, addressing the question, does Japan have a nuclear-free future? I'm going to ask you to come back again, if you would, please. Mark, would you agree to come back again and continue this conversation? And Arnie and Maggie, please do.
Of course, yes.
But could you go to the ironies that you had written about in your book, so that we haven't answered this question completely? Does Japan have a nuclear-free future? I, for one, and the public who are watching, I hope so. And from what I've learned today and from the book, I believe that it is possible that it does.
Well, one of the things that touched me and why I loved Mark's book so much is he talks about how Japan can be a leader,
Yes.
a world leader. And, you know, they're on the cusp. That's the tipping point, that they can do something.
And you know, one of the things that's been so frustrating to me about this book is it's not available in Japanese. And Arnie, you brought it over to your publisher, and I hope that they'll take a look at it. I haven't heard from them. But I desperately would like to get, it's a very short little book if somebody in Japan is looking at this.
Yes. Well, I'm going to hold it up too, and to show people just what it looks like. I'm holding it in my hand, and I've been reading it on ebook myself and enjoying it very, very much. But this is the book itself. It's a small book, as they say in the back, on a huge topic. And the fact is that this book has not been reviewed in the major book reviews that I read all the time, like the New Yorker book review.